Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. Qui si apre la programmazione editoriale della 36esima edizione del Salone Internazionale del Libro di Torino. Volevo salutarvi anch'io, ma non vi ruberò tempo alla magnifica lezione di Elizabeth Strout. Volevo salutarvi per dirvi quanto sono felice di questo momento e quanto l'ho aspettato. E per noi, per il Salone, è davvero un grande onore ospitare questa grande scrittrice. È una delle mie scrittrici preferite e quindi sono particolarmente emozionata. Qui c'è la sua casa editrice, le sue magnifiche traduttrici che saluto e che ringrazio, e ho avuto il piacere e l'onore di leggere in anteprima questa lezione quando Elizabeth Strout l'ha mandata per la prima volta e mi ha profondamente entusiasmato e commosso. E chiamo Elizabeth Strout qui e vi auguro buon ascolto.
And I thought then, okay, I've done it. Because my entire believed in this power of fiction, that it allows us to see into other people's lives and to recognize our own feelings, and maybe for many of those women who responded to Olive that way, they can feel better about themselves because they never did steal their daughter-in-law's brassiere or one shoe, but they wanted to. Olive has become their friend. And it was in Italy when a woman spoke to me in Italian after my presentation, and the interpreter said to me, she said you have seen into her soul. And that right there is all I ever wanted, to make someone else feel not so alone in their private thoughts. I believed from a very, very young age that I would be able to do that if I just never gave up. I was 42 years old when my first book, Amy Isabel, was published. So how did I keep myself going all those years? The truth is, I have no memory of myself not being a writer, which means that by the age of 4 or 5, I was writing things down in those children's notebooks they used to have that had, those huge spaces between the lines. And this was because of my mother. Only many, many years later did I realize that she had wanted to be a writer herself. It makes me think of Carl Jung's quote, "Nothing affects the life of a child so much as the unlived life of its parent." But my mother was the furnace of my life, and it was my mother who gave me those notebooks. And she said, write down what you do today. So if we went into town to buy me new little red sneakers, my mother said to me when we got home, write down what the man was like who sold us those sneakers. And so I did. But you're not going to be a writer just because when you're little your mother tells you to write down what you did today. There are multitudes of other factors in the making of a writer. And one of them for me was isolation. We lived back then in New Hampshire and also in Maine, and in both places we lived far outside the town. In the woods, there were no other houses around for many years, and I played in those woods alone. In New Hampshire there was a creek and also a stone wall, and my parental directions were do not cross this creek and do not cross the stone wall, and in that way I had 4 acres of woods and pine needles and wildflowers all to myself for hours on end. I was extraordinarily happy in those woods. The beauty of the physical world seemed to be my first and dearest friend. I would play with the toads and the turtles that were in the creek, and then there were the wildflowers that I gathered and brought home to my mother. She pressed them in a big book for me. This ability to be alone, this joy in being alone, I have often thought served me very well for the life of the writer I was to become. I should add that we had no television. My parents did not believe in it. They were Puritans and very strict, and we had no newspapers as well. The news came from a radio in the kitchen, which was turned on every morning, and so interestingly, I remember the day when the radio announced that Papa Hemingway had died. I was 5 years old that day, but I remember the newscaster's voice coming through that radio about this man, Papa Hemingway, and my mother had tears in her eyes. Now, we didn't have a piano, and I took lessons. At some point, I wanted to quit my piano lessons, and my mother did not let me. I went on to study eventually with a retired concert pianist who was at the University of New Hampshire, and he taught me this, that every single note matters. And I think of him often as I write, because every single word matters. Now, about reading, I should say I have no memory of children's books in the house. My mother never read to me as a child, and it was my father who taught me to read. But on the top of a bookshelf in our living room was a row of blue books in cheap covers. This was the work of Hemingway. My grandfather had bought them from a traveling salesman, and during the summer of my 17th year, I read them all straight through. But before then, I would make lists for myself of books to read and either get them from the library or buy paperbacks with my babysitting money. And I think in this way I was very self-taught, which also, as I look back, was a really good thing for my life as a writer. Because I could accept these books by myself. The texts would rise up to me with no teacher telling me anything about them at all. And so there was a purity to that. But it's not just books that make a writer. A writer, I think, has to be unbelievably curious about people around them. And we had very few people around us in these towns. Whenever I did go into town with my parents, my father would go and do his business, and my mother and I would wait in the car, watching people walk by the sidewalk. Once I remember my mother said, "Oh, look at that woman. She's not anxious to get home to her husband." And I scrambled in my seat, watched the woman my mother was talking about, and I said, "How can you tell?" And my mother said, "Just look at her." And so I noticed then that the woman's expression, she seemed grim. And look at the hem of her coat. It hasn't been fixed in ages, my mother added. She's depressed. I watched the woman all the way down the sidewalk, and I wanted to go into her house. I wanted to see what her front doorway looked like. Were there any boots and shoes by the door? What did her kitchen smell like? I will in this talk keep returning to my mother because she was so instrumental in my becoming a writer. But what about my father? He was a very kind man, a deacon of a congregational church, and he was a scientist. He was a professor at the University of New Hampshire. Here is an example of the difference between my parents. One Sunday when I was very small, we went to church. And what I remember was that a woman who my parents knew, named Clara, wore a hat. Now you have to understand, at this time, congregational churches in New England were just as plain as they could be. And except for Easter, no one ever wore a hat. But Clara, that day, had worn a hat. And it was some hat. It had twirling things coming off it, and some fake fruit was on it. And it was a little bit scary to me. As we drove home, my mother said to my father, "Now why in hell did Clara wear that hat?" And my father said, as he frequently did, "If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all." And this is a great sentiment, but it is death for a writer. And it has occurred to me more than once that as a writer, I have tried to combine my mother's keen eye with my father's natural compassion. And then a few years later, this happened. When I was about 12 years old, we suddenly got neighbors. A little white house was built next to ours, and into it moved a couple and a nice couple and a cute baby. And I babysat with the baby, and one time, my parents must have been out of town because they spent the night at the neighbor's house after babysitting. And in the morning, the woman of the house made French toast, and she cut it in diagonal slices and sprinkled confectionery sugar over the top. And in my entire life, I had never seen anything so beautiful. So when my parents returned home, I told my mother about this thing of wonder, hoping, of course, that she might take the hint and start making French toast for us in such a manner. And she listened to me. She let me go on. And then when I was done, she said, "Well, Elizabeth, just remember, you never know." And boy, did that turn my head around. She meant, of course, you never know what goes on in anyone's house. And she was right. And I think it was at that moment that my curiosity became absolutely inflamed, because we don't know what goes on inside anyone's home. Not really. We often don't know everything that is going on in our own home. And we certainly don't know what is going on in someone else's mind. This was about the same time that I realized we will never know, on this earth anyway, what it is like to be another person. We will only see things through our own two eyes. And boy, did that frustrate me. One time, gave a talk in which I mentioned at length how important it was to imagine what it was like to be another person. I went on about how it gives us empathy and all that sort of thing. And afterward, this very cheerful woman walked up to me and she said, "That was so interesting. I have never once tried to imagine what it's like to be another person." And I thought, well, what is that like? What's it like to be you? My fascination with other people began at such a young age that I can barely remember not looking at someone and wondering, who are you? Later in New York City on the subways, I would sit across from a woman and I would think, okay, I know what that feels like to have your jeans that tight. And I would watch the expressions on the faces of these people. And when I left the train, sometimes I would arrange my own face, like the face of a man who I had seen with a furrow in his brow and his lips puckered. And I realized, oh, if your face is like that all the time, you're very worried. My point is, this has become so instinctive for me for so many years that I cannot remember never doing it. So we have a mother encouraging her daughter to write things down. We have the books in the house. We have a curiosity about other people, but still, we need more than that to create a fiction writer. We need to make the sentences into something that can get conveyed to another person. And thus began my very long apprenticeship in finding my own storytelling voice. By the time I was 16 years old, I was typing up stories on an old Smith Corona typewriter that my parents had. I sent them all to the New Yorker and to the Atlantic, and they all came back within 2 weeks with what was then a Xerox copy that said, "We are sorry, but this story is not for us." I was not deterred. I suppose my mother must have known about this, but if so, she never said a word. My mother taught English at our local high school, yet having her teaching in the school was uncomfortable for me, and I think it was uncomfortable for her as well. I never felt I could get out from being Mrs. Strout's daughter in high school. I really did not like it, and with my mother's encouragement, I left high school after my junior year without graduating and went straight to college in Maine. This was when I had my first sort of mentor. The chairman of the English department at this college was a teacher of mine my first semester, and I liked him, and he liked me. And we talked in his office sometimes, and I told him I wanted to be a writer. "Let me see your stuff," he said, and so I did. And if I wrote something this professor didn't think was very good, he would say, "I don't think this is very good." If I wrote something he liked, he would say, "I like this." One day he said, "You know, Liz, how about every time you have a paper due in class, you give me a short story instead, and it will be out of the secret." So I did, and I took every class I could with that man. But I never took a creative writing class the whole time I was in college. My intuition told me it would not be helpful to me to hear what my peers thought of my work. And I never took a psychology class either. Again, my intuition told me that what I needed to know about people would not be found in a psychology class. I want to say this about intuition. It is essential for a fiction writer. My mother had this sort of intuition, and I believe I inherited it from her. A number of years ago, I was sitting in a hotel room with her, and she glanced out the window and she said, "Oh, second wife." And I said, "Mom, come on, how do you know that's the second wife?" And so I went to the window and I said, "Oh yeah, second wife." I was married to a trial lawyer at the time who always liked proof. And there is no proof when you're a writer. There is only your intuition. When I graduated from college, this professor who had been kind to me said, "No one will be interested in your work." And he was exactly right. No one was remotely interested. But I was determined, and I took jobs that left me the time or mental space to keep writing, meaning I mostly worked in bars at night, either playing the piano or cocktail waitressing. I moved to England for a year and worked at a pub in Oxford, always writing. My father, by the way, was distraught by that professor of mine was correct. Nobody was interested in my work. Nobody cared. At that point, I had learned not to tell people what I knew about myself, that I was a writer. Because if I ever did, they would look at me with a variety of responses. Mostly pity for being so self-delusional, and also for thinking grandiosity. So I just didn't tell anyone. I think even my mother at that point had lost faith in me. And my father was essentially just waiting for me to get married. One night when I was cocktail waitressing, I had a thought, and the thought was this. If I'm a 58-year-old cocktail waitress, I don't know why it's 58, but if I'm a 58-year-old cocktail waitress, and I have failed at my writing, that will have been a pathetic life. Keep that in mind. I'll return to it. Again, the thought was, if I'm a 58-year-old cocktail waitress and a failed writer, my life would have been pathetic. So, I went to law school. I went to Syracuse Law School, which felt like a different country to me in some way. And then I dropped out of law school after my first year, and I wrote a really bad novel. But here's something interesting. Syracuse had a writing program, and I mostly hung out with the writers in that program and not so much the law students. So why did I not transfer into that writing program? Well, first, I'm not sure I would have gotten in. I got to know Raymond Carter personally. He was such a kind man. And I showed him a story of mine at the urging of his students, and he said, I really don't like stories in the second person. I also took one class with Tobias Wolff. He's also very lovely to me. And I dropped out of the class so I could still get my money back because he praised his students' piece of work that I thought was not praiseworthy at all. So I did not apply to that program. I somehow knew and still know that to be the writer I was, I had to rely on my own sense of what my work was worth and what was worthy of praise. But I also didn't apply to that writing program because I noticed this, that the students there, my friends, talked about writing all the time, but in fact they were actually doing far less writing than I was on my own. So during this time of not being in school, I had my usual assortment of jobs. At one point, I landed a job in a department store, which I thought was going to be absolutely glamorous. And it turned out I could not sell. The manager watched me and she said, Elizabeth, if somebody comes in to buy a skirt, then you're to walk over to them with a blouse and say, this blouse would look just terrific with that skirt. But I couldn't do it. I didn't like it when sales clerks did that to me, and I could not do it to others. So, I was sent up to the 8th floor to sell mattresses. I would sit on one of them with my notebook and write, and I never sold a mattress, not one. Maybe once a week, a couple would step up the elevator and tentatively walk in, and I would say, try any mattress. And after a few moments, they walked out. I went back to law school. But here was something I had noticed in that department store. That in the women's lounge, the restroom, there would be a number of older women who sat there for much of the day. They would bring a paper bag of who knows what and just sit there. And I understood they had no place to go. These older women moved me very much. I noticed that they did not talk to each other. Their loneliness was palpable. So I went back to law school and I also got myself a gerontology certificate at the School of Social Work. My idea was that I would do elder law and that I would have a little storefront on the main street of the town and that any elderly person who wanted to could come sit in it all day. And then I would write at night. Anyway, I also, during this time, worked in the nursing home of the town. I befriended a woman who lived there named She had no teeth, and she was supposed to be allowed to get dentures, though nobody ever had gotten them for her. So I set out to do this. The day before we were near the dentist, Mary Anna wanted me to polish her fingernails, and I remember painting her fingernails a bright red as her hands my interest in gerontology came from the fact that in Maine we lived on a dirt road with a few other small houses, and in these houses lived my great aunts. So my young world consisted of these older women who were quite depressed, and they would gather and speak in their dry Maine accents of their dead husbands and the last meals that these men ate. One of my great aunts was a woman named Olive. She's probably the sweetest one of them. I remember her tapping a cigarette and saying, "I'm so glad Frank had the mackerel last night and potatoes just the way he liked them." Children often feel responsible for those around them, and I suspect that I felt responsible for these elderly aunts of mine. In any event, I have always been interested in the elderly. All right, so I graduated from law school, and I got a job with legal services, and I was terrible at it. I did not have an adversarial bone in my body, but I did not know that until one of my clients' services went out, and I was told by the lawyer in the office, "Well, call the school board and tell them we'll see them in court tomorrow." I had to close the door to my office, my palms left sweat marks on the desk, and I neatly made a phone call. And I understood I was just terrible. I had a darling client one time whose benefits had been cut, and I went to plead his case before an administrative law judge who said to me, "You have nice legs." And then he denied the benefits to my client. It was about this time that I went home one day after work, and I stood in the backyard and I thought to myself, okay, I can be a terrible lawyer for the rest of my life, or I can give myself over and write forever, even if it doesn't work out. And that's when I remembered how I had had that thought years earlier, that if I was a 58-year-old cocktail waitress and my writing had not worked out, it would have been a pathetic life. And I stood there on that back lawn, and I thought, no, that would not have been a pathetic life. A pathetic life is if I do not try with my entire heart to be the writer I have always known that I am. At that point, I was married with a small child, and we moved to New York City, and I still wrote every minute that I could. I got a job teaching English at a community college, and I loved it. I would teach in the mornings and come home before my daughter got home from school and would write those few hours every day. Now, when I was 30 years old, this happened. I read a short story in a magazine, and I really liked the story, and I saw it in the byline that the author was a fiction editor at the New Yorker, and his name was Dan Menaker. So I sent the story to him directly, and he wrote a personal note saying it was good, please try it again. And so I did. And he called me up and told me that the story had been rejected only by one role, and to keep on trying. It was to be 13 more years before I had a story published in the New Yorker. But Dan Menaker, during most of those years, would write me the loveliest rejections. I probably only sent him 2 stories a year, but he was always very generous in his response to them, and it helped keep me going. But it was about this time that I thought, what is wrong with my work? Why is it not happening? And I kept thinking, there must be some truth I'm not getting at. But I could not for the life of me figure out what the truth was that was eluding me. When we moved to the city, I became interested in comedy, and my husband and I would go to the little stand-up comedy clubs in the village, and I realized this: when people laughed, it was because something had been said that was true. So I began to wonder, what would come out of my mouth if I was immediately responsible to the people standing here in front of me? So I signed up for a stand-up comedy class at the new school. And it was one of the most frightening things that I have ever done. As a final exam, I had to perform at a comedy club in New York. I didn't allow anyone I knew to attend, and the place was packed that night. When it was my turn, I stepped up and began my routine, and in a moment, there was a low laughter from a man, and I will never forget that. What I felt toward this man was almost pure water. was right. It worked. My routine was all about making fun of myself as an uptight white woman from New England. And I swear to you that until I did that routine, I did not even know I was a white woman. That's how white I was. And I did not really understand until I did that routine what it meant to come from New England. It was its own separate culture. And so I began to write Amy and Isabel, what would be my first published novel, about an uptight white woman from New England who works in a shoe factory, as I had worked one summer. I am not Isabel Goodrow, but I understood her. For 2 years, that completed book sat on our dining room table while I looked in vain for an agent. And then a friend suggested that I contact Dan Editor, who had since moved to Random House as an editor. And so I sent him the book, and he loved it. He said, let's get you an agent. And the next week, I had 5 different lunches with 5 different agents who all wanted to take me on. When the book came out, it did very well. And while I should have been pleased, the truth is, I was terrified. All of a sudden, there were reporters in our home. People magazine did a shoot of me on my bicycle. I had to make sure I was wearing something red. And the whole thing was overwhelming. I was sent to 27 cities on a book tour, and back then there were local television shows that I had to be on. And I could not tell anyone how frightened I was. Everybody was very excited about me. Many people said, what an overnight success. And I thought, yeah, about a 40-year overnight success. But never mind. I persevered as I had done my whole life, and as I have continued to do so. And it turned out I began to write faster and faster. It was as though I had been training for a marathon my whole life, and I was now running it. I remained clear to my mission that fiction matters. In fiction, we can find the friends we need if we are lucky. We can find small moments of grace if we are lucky. When my daughter was very small, she lined up all the stuffed animals one day in her room and she said, Mommy, come look. And she put her spring little hand in mine and said with a sweep of her other hand, these are my friends. And I have never forgotten them. My hope is that my characters that I have written will become friends to my readers the way so many characters have